I'm Dr. Andrew Newberg, and I'm here to talk today about my latest book, Sex, God, and the Brain. Our journey begins with an intriguing question. What happens in our brain when we engage in sexual activity or spiritual practices? To find the answer, we used cutting-edge scientific tools to observe the brain's response to our most intimate human experiences. All of the rituals that we have as human beings that are part of our religious systems, they ultimately, if we take the evolutionary perspective, come from the rituals that are ultimately mating rituals in animals. We discovered significant overlaps in the brain areas involved with sexual arousal and those involved with deep spiritual experiences. This overlap suggests a profound connection between our spiritual and our sexual selves. Join me in exploring the critical role of spirituality in health and discover how to enrich your life with deeper meaning and well-being.
Welcome, everybody. As most of you know, we're here to celebrate Dr. Andrew Newberg's new book that's coming out August 6th called Sex, God, and the Brain. I have read this book, and it's one of the best things I've read in a very long time. And I can brag that I've read most of the classics and then a few other things too. So you can call me an authority. My name is Bob Wilms. Some of you know me. I'm Andrew's publicist and working with him on the release of this very exciting book. And I'm going to start with a brief intro for those of you who don't know who Dr. Andrew Newberg is and give you a little background to his career. Dr. Andrew Newberg is the Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health and a physician at Jefferson University Hospital. Dr. Andrew is board certified in both internal and nuclear medicine. His research focuses on the relationship between brain function and various mental states, particularly religious and mystical experiences, and has included brain scans during prayer, meditation, as well as studies on aging, dementia, and other neurological disorders. Dr. Andrews conducted a groundbreaking study of the impact of orgasmic meditation on the brain using PET and fMRI technology. I'm not going to give you the number of things he's published. You can take my word for it. He's published a lot of things and has had a successful career in medicine. And he's actually, Andy, you've developed a new discipline called neurotheology. Is that correct?
Well, I certainly have contributed substantially to it.
Contributed. Okay.
Sometimes called a pioneer, I guess. That might be the best term.
We'll go with that. So Dr. Andrew is gracing us with his presence all the way from the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. It's good to see you, Andy.
Thank you. Great to see you too.
Yeah.
And great to have everyone here.
Yeah, great. So as I said, I really enjoyed this book a lot. You've been working in the discipline of neurotheology for decades. Most of our viewers on the webinar today know maybe a little bit about you and your history, but maybe give us a little context. Why Sex, God, and the Brain? Why is this book coming out now? And what is it for you?
Yeah, well, so as you mentioned, I mean, I've been looking into this whole field of research and scholarship, looking at the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves. For about 30 years. I first connected with two mentors back in the early 1990s, one who was in the field of nuclear medicine that got me very involved in doing brain imaging and studying all the things that you mentioned in the introduction, different disease states and so forth. And then I also had the good fortune to connect with a researcher who was a psychiatrist by training, and also had a PhD in anthropology. And he had been looking at the relationship between the brain and religion even further back, going into the 1970s. His name was Dr. Eugene de Quilly. But he had an interesting take on it as an anthropologist. He was looking at kind of where is the evolutionary piece to all of this. And so when I first met him, he was heavily involved in trying to explore that piece of this connection. And but we also realized that part of what we needed to do was to develop these neuroscientific tools to be able to study various types of rituals and practices like meditation and prayer and so forth. And so eventually, as I like to say, the proverbial light bulb went off, and I said, "Oh, gee, if we're doing all these brain scans of people who have Alzheimer's disease or depression or whatever, we're looking at these different mental states. Why can't we study the mental states associated with prayer and meditation and other types of spiritual practices?" So that was really what kind of, started off in many ways, bringing neurotheology as a concept to reality. I mean, we'd always been talking about this relationship, but we never really had the brain scans, the science behind it to help to put that whole connection together. But at the same time, I always kind of hearkened back to, unfortunately, Gene DeQuilly left this earth a little too soon. I had been working with him for about 6 or 7 years when he died very suddenly of a very large heart attack. It was very upsetting and traumatic time for all of us who knew him well. But and so I kind of continued into the neuroscience world, which was certainly my world. But I had always had this longing to kind of reconnect with this discussion about the evolution of the brain and the evolution of different aspects of spirituality in the context of the brain. And part of that whole connection had to do with rituals. He loved rituals. He was always we would go to these dinner parties that were loaded with rituals about who was going to say certain things when, and what drinks you would have, and what songs you would sing, and all kinds of crazy stuff. Meanwhile, around the table are like Nobel Prize winners, literally Nobel Prize winners, and people who had revolutionized psychology and medicine and all this. But they're all doing these kind of fun and crazy rituals. And the reason that rituals were so important to him was that they are a fundamental part of religion. And in fact, they're a fundamental part of virtually every aspect of human life, but specifically religious and spiritual traditions. And so, all of us who have grown up or known anything about a given tradition know that there are ceremonies, there are holidays, there are practices, there are things that you do over and over again. There's a rhythmic element to them, both in terms of what you're doing in the moment, but also a kind of rhythmic element to them in terms of doing them every year at the same time, passing them on from generation to generation. The rhythms kind of, build on top of each other. But where do all these kind of rituals and rhythms come from? Well, if you're an anthropologist, the answer is that, well, they had to evolve in the brain. And if rituals found their way into the human brain, they most likely got there through rituals in other brains, in other animals' brains. And this is where we start to head in this direction, to your question, which is that if we look at animal rituals, and the animal world is loaded with rituals, there's all kinds of rituals, and very complex, and dancing and moving around and flapping wings and making calls and all that kind of thing. But all of those rituals are mating rituals, and they're all about connecting one animal to another, identifying an animal as part of you, part of your species, and then coming together in a very intimate connection to mate, to propagate the species. So ultimately, if all animal rituals are mating rituals, that's based on sexuality and the sexual process and the mating process. Well, then that has something to do with all of the rituals that then became part of humanity. And so that's really what led to this idea of sex, God, and the brain, which is that if we really think about it from an evolutionary perspective, the rituals that are a part of our religious traditions, our educational systems, the political systems that we're all watching, they all derive ultimately from these mating rituals that we find in animals, and hence they are deeply rooted in the sexual urges, the sexual energy that really makes us who we are as human beings. And to me, it makes sense. I mean, especially if you're thinking about religion as being perhaps, between religion and science, these are the two most powerful forces that have guided humanity. It makes sense that they would be, that these kinds of rituals and these practices would be embedded at a very primal level of who we are, and kind of tap into the energy and the power that sexuality has for us. And of course, we see certainly in the early religious traditions that, they're all about fertility and creation and so forth. And that creative force is really what sexuality is all about. So the sexual and the spiritual impulses that are within us seem to derive from the same basic components within the brain.
Well said. And one of the things that was on my mind for this conversation in particular is those early religious rituals blew my mind when I read about them in the book, because sexuality and that's erotic impulse or arousal was a part of those rituals. So can you tell us a little bit about that history, things like the Temple of Venus and the Temple of Artemis?
Yes, well, going back, thousands of years and perhaps even further back. I mean, some of the earliest figurines that we have discovered that seem to have some type of religious value to them, some kind of religious meaning to them, tend to be fertility goddesses. And so the whole idea about fertility and sexuality really are embedded in some of the earliest traditions that we have. And you mentioned some specific examples where and we see this in the art and the sculptures and so forth of many ancient temples, that the whole idea of eroticism and sexuality as being a kind of fundamental part of the energy that surrounds those particular traditions. And so, there are well-known approaches even today, like tantric yoga and how they really try to embrace sexuality as a very fundamental part. And it is interesting. I mean, it's both female as well as male sexuality. In fact, a little bit in the book, I talk about just the incredible amount of phallic symbols in ancient religious traditions all the way up to today, in the tall towers and so forth that we have built, and the symbols that we utilize, that there's always this kind of referencing back to something that's sexual, that's a fundamental part of who we are.
I'm going to say something that is slightly inappropriate, but I figure it's in your book, so it's okay.
It's okay.
I'm quoting from Mindy's book, so
Oh, no.
give me a little bit of cut me a little slack here. But you draw the phonetic, or I don't know if you would say phonetic or grammatical origin of the word. Yeah, you know where I'm going.
Yes.
The word testicle versus testify.
Right. Right. Well, there are some people who have argued that the concept of testifying of which is basically about kind of honoring the truth, making some type of covenant that you are going to follow. That the term testify does sound very similar to testicle. And in the ancient world, that was part of how various agreements and covenants were made with people, at least between men, which was to basically touch or to symbolize their genitalia as, this is sacred to me, and this is what I'm now going to do, what I'm now going to say is fundamental. And of course, if you go to the Bible, I mean, the covenant between God and Abraham is through the process of circumcision. So, you're really talking about a lot of emphasis on in these cases, the male genitalia, but again, throughout, all the traditions, we see both male and female sexuality being a fundamental part of these traditions.
So we could have a cultural lexicon that entered into consciousness before, sign the deal in blood,
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Thank you. That was, I love talking about this stuff. The next one. So we go from these early religious rituals that incorporated sexuality to present day. And so I remember growing up as a kid, my family's Greek, and I grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church, and we would be kneeling at the pew, and the one thing that I remember, aside from it being incredibly boring, is the smell. Like, you could smell the frankincense that was wafting through the halls of the church. And one of the things that you draw in the book is how those religious ceremonies divorced themselves from sex and from sexuality at some point, but they're still using the same code that that exists in the primal mating rituals. Can you talk a little bit about that evolution?
Sure, sure. That's a great question. And, one of the things that myself and my mentor, Gene DeQuilly, talked so much about in the context of animal rituals and mating rituals is that they're very stimulatory. There's the rhythmic element of them, which can be in the form of music or body movements. But basically what you're doing to stimulate the brain, to stimulate the body, you're using every sensory processing, every sensory system that you can, basically. So if you think about, any rituals that any of you have engaged in, and whether they had to do with sexuality or spirituality, you mentioned a perfect example about being in church. Well, think about all the sensory stimuli that occur in church. You have the smells that you were talking about. So the sense of smell, and that it could be the incense, it could be the smell of the wood in the building, it could be the smell of the bodies in the building, and the people with you. Then you have the visual stimuli, and that could be various symbols that are religious, and it could be a cross, it could be a crescent, it could be the image of God or a saint or whatever. That these visual images, these visual representations, even what a minister or priest or rabbi or imam are wearing, that's visual, and it's giving you some kind of visual stimuli. There's the touch. You talked about kneeling. So you're feeling something in your knees. You're putting your body in a certain position. Sometimes you're touching people next to you. You might be holding hands. You might touch a sacred book or something like that. And then taste as well. So many traditions utilize wine, different foods, and so forth. You think about the communion in the Christian context of the wine and the wafer that you taste, and all of that is very stimulating to the brain. It means these are things that we need to pay attention to, and it takes it. In the context of ritual, it takes everything to a different level. So, and communion is a great example here, because it's not that you sort of understand a certain religious concept about sort of the blood of Christ, for example. It's not that you just cognitively understand it, but you are partaking in it. It becomes a part of you, becomes a part, you feel it in your body. And again, this is true of all traditions. So we're just taking this one as an example. But this to me is so powerful. And of course, mating rituals have all of the same things. So if you look into the animal world and you look at the mating rituals, there are the smells that the animal has. There oftentimes are the visual displays. It could be the beautiful plumage of a peacock, or it could be certain movements that one animal spots and sees those movements in another. It's certainly the feeling of touch, and sometimes taste as well. So all the different ways in which we sense the world, really we're taking advantage of that in all the rituals that we have. And it does ultimately go back to all the sensory stimuli that are part of that mating ritual that causes a sense of arousal, that causes us to feel energized, and that really brings our whole being to this kind of ecstatic experience, ultimately, that can be a sexual ecstasy or it could be a spiritual ecstasy, depending on the context.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Well said. I find this whole topic fascinating. So fast forward to today's day and age, right? There are lots of things that we can talk about about the current state of affairs in the world. Some really good things, and some things that are wild and chaotic. And one of the things that that I wanted to touch on is this book comes out of a very, very interesting cultural moment. And I've been, I keep my eye out on different trends and things that are happening in culture for a variety of reasons. And one of them that I've noticed is recently there has been a lot of envelope pushing when it comes to entering sexuality into the cultural conversation. So there's a new book out called On All Fours by Miranda July that is catching fire, especially in reading clubs all over the country. Women are talking about it a lot. Of course, we have our nonprofit has Women Over Dinner, where a lot of those conversations take place. There's an openness to that conversation, also seen by some things like the Emma Stone movie Poor Things, that really push this envelope. And so it seems like you're bringing back into the conversation a sacred impulse that has been, I wouldn't say forgotten. It hasn't in religion. It's been forgotten or controlled or whatever you want to call it. And so I just would love to hear your thoughts on why this is an important development and how this can move our culture towards greater unity and connection.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that maybe the best way to answer that is to say that, and I address this fairly extensively in the book, which is that sexuality, like spirituality, can be a wonderful thing. It can be create a sense of intimacy. It's fundamental to relationships between people. It helps to bond people together. It obviously helps to ultimately, procreate our species. So it's just absolutely essential and fundamental to who we are as human beings. And it can create that feeling of love and intimacy and compassion that we have for one another. However, there is this dark side of sexuality and spirituality, and things can go down bad paths. And obviously, we can have anywhere, on a continuum from, sexual harassment and not, just not being very nice because of different sexual statements or whatever that we have, to sexual abuse, ultimately to violence and even rape and murder and so forth, that has all embedded within this very powerful impulse. And religion, of course, is very similar. I mean, religion can be wonderful. It can bring people together. It can create charities, altruism, compassion for other people, compassion for all of humanity. But it also leads to a great deal of violence and how many people have been killed in the name of God, of course, over the millennia. So I think that, one of the things that I have learned in all of the research that I've done on the studies of the mind and who we are as human beings is that we're always kind of in this balance, if you will. And that balance has to do with the value of certain things like sexuality, which are absolutely fundamental to who we are, but regulating and balancing it with the other aspects of who we are. And so, to me, I think that kind of answers this question about where we are today, which is, when things become out of balance one way or another, it can lead to a great deal of animosity. It can lead to a great deal of fear, hatred, anger, and even violence. But hopefully, and this is, where I go in the book, is to say that by trying to embrace the positive elements, the ability to come together, the ability to be empathic for others, the ability to have a sense of oneness and connectedness with each other, that if we can kind of go down those paths more effectively and talk about these things more openly, then hopefully we will get to a more positive perspective on sexuality, on spirituality, and on humanity itself. So I think that, what I hope comes out of all of this kind of work is a greater appreciation for people who have different beliefs than we have, but an ability to find ways of being more intimate and more open to other people. And I think that, utilizing that sexual energy, which is a way of connecting with people in positive ways, I think that can be a very valuable tool to help that. But again, it has to be balanced. And again, the theologians through the ages, you look at Thomas Aquinas and so forth, talking about the actus humanus and the actus hominis, where we talk about the animal parts of ourselves and the human parts of ourselves. So these are different ways in which we have to always balance who we are, and they become a very fundamental part of how we as individuals and how we as humanity ultimately need to kind of look at our world. And so hopefully this kind of knowledge, this kind of information that, not only sort of talks about the balance, but sort of helps us to understand what's going on in the brain itself, will help us to find those paths that'll be valuable for people.
Beautiful. Thank you. As someone who's practiced quite a lot of spiritual disciplines, from Vipassana meditation to Tibetan Buddhism, yoga, and Om, I've definitely experienced the positive elements of it and the empathic quality that you speak to as a possibility of having greater sexual connectedness in your life is something that I've definitely experienced. And so would love to transition now to talking about this new paper that that you just had published. This is your long-term impact study of OM, and that was published in Frontiers of Neuroimaging, I think this last week.
Neuroscience, yep.
Neuroscience, thank you. And so, yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about the study, and then I figured you could share some of your scans about the study with the audience.
Absolutely. So yeah, so this study really grew out of the data that we had from the original study that we did on OM. And so what we were looking at, we had the opportunity to take advantage of the fact that we did a variety of different scans on people. And one of the things that we were able to do is look at just the resting scan, just the baseline scan, whatever term you want to use, but what the brain was just doing when it wasn't doing any particular practice. It was just kind of in its baseline neutral state. And so one of the things that we needed that state in order to see what was going on during the actual practice itself, but we can also then look at that state by itself and try to understand if there are anything, are there any patterns that we see in the activity of the brain of people who have been doing OM for a long period of time compared to people who have not been doing OM for a long period of time and who just consider to be just otherwise, healthy controls, just people who are non-meditators, so to speak. And we've done this with other studies. We've done this by looking at other kinds of meditation practices, and there's even other colleagues of mine out there who have done these kinds of studies. So, but this, of course, was the first time anybody's ever looked at the brains of people who specifically are doing the orgasmic meditation practice. So what we did was we compared the brains of the people who have done OM for a number of years to those people who have not. And we see some really interesting differences that in the brain. Now, the one slight piece to this, which is which has always been a little bit of an issue that I have to be clear about, is that we're kind of capturing a snapshot, if you will, of where the person is today. And we did not do a longitudinal study where we took people before they ever started doing OM and then see how it changed them. But what's interesting to me is that, when we have looked at both longitudinal studies over time, as well as these kind of cross-sectional studies, I think what we've come to learn is that while people may have a certain predisposition to enjoying a particular kind of practice, doing the practice itself clearly has an impact on people, and it does change the brain over time. So when we look at this particular data, when we look at this study, what we found was, as I mentioned, that there are significant differences in the people who have been doing OM for a long period of time compared to those who have not. And what's interesting is that they seem to be in a number of the pattern, the differences seem to be in a number of areas of the brain that we also found were involved when the practice was being done, areas of the brain that support our ability to connect with other people, to feel a sense of oneness and connectedness with another person, to feel a sense of flow with another person. And we can talk about all of these in a little bit of detail in a moment when we look at some of the images. But nonetheless, what I think this ultimately kind of tells us, and we've seen this in some other practices as well, is that part of what happens as you do the practice, you obviously see a change in the moment, but you also see this longer term effect, which to me, I think the best way of kind of understanding it is that it potentiates the ability to have different kinds of experiences, to have these kinds of spiritual experiences. So the practice itself is a thing that you do, is a practice that you're doing, but then there are experiences that arise when you're doing the practice that as you do it more and more, there is a kind of training effect, if you will. There's a change that occurs that enables your brain to be able to engage those experiences more and more. And again, to sort of take it to a more neutral perspective. If you think about, like a Buddhist meditator who might meditate for 20 years before they achieve enlightenment, even though they achieve enlightenment 20 years from now, they needed all those other practices to sort of prime the brain for having that experience. And I think Om very likely, based on this data, works in a very similar kind of way, that it changes the brain over time, that enables people to have these kinds of powerful experiences that are very spiritual for them.
Beautiful. Do you want to show some of the slides with and go through some of the key findings?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me share my screen. I'm just going to show a couple of scans for people. These are images of the brain. We're actually starting about, I would say, about midway up the brain, and then it goes all the way up towards the top of the brain. And we can use, these are called slices, and these are what are referred to as axial slices. So it's basically as if you kind of pop, made a slice through from the front to back, pop the top of the head off, and now you're kind of looking down on the brain. And so, and hopefully you can see my pointer, but the top of each image is actually right behind your forehead, and the bottom of the image is the back of the brain. So that's the way we look at it. And then you have left and right. And so what you're looking at here, these colors represent the differences between the Om group and the non-Om group, the control group. And you're seeing so all for the most part, these are all blue, which in and of itself is interesting. So what we found is that almost across the board in all the individuals who participated, as well as in the males and the females, that we tended to see overall decreases in some of these key areas. And again, what I think that ultimately is telling us is that it kind of, when the person was actually doing these practices, we also saw decreases. And so I think in some ways this kind of helps them already get to where they need to go, and hopefully, tries to do that quicker each subsequent time the person does the practice. So some of the areas that are really interesting here, if you look on the sort of top row of slices, and I won't go into too much detail on all of these things, but you see a couple of blue areas towards the top of the scan. That's part of the frontal lobe. That's actually an area called the cingulate gyrus, which is very involved in concentration, focusing attention, regulating emotions. And when this area is decreased, part of what we tend to see is let me say it this way. When the frontal lobe turns on, we are concentrating, we're focusing attention, we're kind of purposely doing things. When the frontal lobe quiets down, we begin to lose that sense of purposefulness and action, and it's a sense of flow, it's a sense of letting go, different words that people use, but that's what we tend to see when people are actually, in the practice. But it looks like these are long-term effects that enable the frontal lobe to kind of maybe get there, even a little bit quicker, because you're already starting at a slightly lower level. One of the other areas of the brain, which I'll just point out here, in the top left slide or scan, is this blue area along the two sides. This is a really important structure called the insula, and the insula is very involved in the ability to perceive emotions and to be able to kind of feel it's not just the feeling of the emotions, but it's sort of how we think about them and what we do with them. And so the fact that the insula is affected by this practice seems to suggest that there are long-term changes that alter the way that we perceive other people's emotions. This is an area of the brain that seems to be involved in feelings of empathy and compassion for other people. So again, really fascinating that we see these kinds of changes going on in areas of the brain that are involved in our sense of flow, how we connect with people. And then if you look probably in the middle row, there's a little area along the kind of towards the bottom of the scan. This is really towards the sort of the back top part. There's some blue areas here. This is the parietal lobe, and this is an area that is often associated with helping us to form our spatial representation of ourself. And it's an area that we have always been very interested in when it comes to meditation and prayer practices, that a person has a decrease in these areas, which seems to be associated with a loss of the sense of self and a feeling of being more connected, more unified, if you will, with another person in the context of sexuality, with a group of people in terms of a group ritual or practice, or even with the universe or God. So again, we see this is not during the practice, this is the resting state of the brain. So it's kind of changing the way the brain is kind of operating and in some senses looking at the world, arguably, that again, if we can take advantage of this and really show in future research that these changes are, long-term and obviously they seem to have some degree of permanence to them. If we can correlate this with feelings of compassion, empathy, and so forth, then that can go a long way to helping us understand how this practice may be very useful and beneficial, not just for individuals, but for the larger society as well. So here are some scans. This next slide looks very similar, but some of the blues kind of changed. These are the male subjects in our study. And as many of the people who may be on the call know, obviously the practice can be done with both males and females. The males who are going to be the strokers are going to have a different experience, but certain elements are going to have similarities to it as well as part of that whole process. And we see changes that are going on in the insula. If you look at this top left-hand corner here, and then actually some of these areas that are along the bottom line of the scan, this is also part of that cingulate cortex. We don't see the anterior part, the front part as much, but we see some of the other areas which are also involved in that sort of, how we sort of connect with another person and how we pay attention to that other person. So we see, a little bit of a distinction between the males on these slides, and then here are some of the other areas that are affected in the females who were part of our study. So again, insula always seems to be involved if you look at some of these areas along the top slides, but then some of the back areas of the brain, which are part of the parietal lobe, these are areas which all seem to be a little bit different. But when you kind of put them all together, it helps us to understand how the two individuals as part of this paired practice may be interacting with each other, might experience the practice a little bit differently, but also, there's certainly a fair amount of overlap in terms of that sense of connectedness and the very powerful kind of unifying experience that's part of the spiritual element of this particular practice. So I'm going to stop the slides there and bring it back, and then we can talk a little bit more if you have specific questions about that, or we can keep going.
Yeah, so we have a limited amount of time, so I think we're going to transition to open up questions to the audience. We obviously don't have time to answer every question, probably just a couple. And so I'm going to also take this time to remind everybody that you will see somewhere in the chat a link for the pre-sale for this incredible new book called Sex, God, and the Brain. Pre-order it right now. That link will take you right to the little place where you can do a one-click and purchase. There are many other places you can search to buy it online. And so I'm actually going to open up questions only to those people that buy the book right now. And you have a question. Oh, I'm getting some fresh news out here that so far the book is #1 new release in religious studies on Amazon. So, Andy, that's a good start.
That's
religious studies first, New York Times next. Okay, here we go. So the first question that we're going to have is going to be, how about we go with Rachel Pelletier? You want to ask a question, Rach?
Yes, I can. Hi, Dr. Andrew.
Hi.
I am very lucky in that I get to speak to Dr. Andrew quite a bit about his work and his research. I was wondering, so you and I have talked about this thing before about orgasmic meditation being a hybrid practice. And I know you mentioned it a little bit with the brain scans in terms of what happens in the various parts of the brain. And I was wondering if you could say more about what you mean when you call it a hybrid practice, and what it can look like in the brain, what it does look like in the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. That's a very important thing, a very important point. So what I actually mean by that, and again, I suppose, hopefully not much of a surprise to the people who do the practice, is the recognition that it is utilizing the sexual impulse, so to speak, the sexual energy that we have as the focus of meditation. And this came up a lot when we were doing our papers, because we felt like we needed to explain this to the world of people who are not familiar with orgasmic meditation. And we said, well, look, there are lots of practices that utilize physiological processes of the body. The most common one is the breath. And so many practices in meditation tell you to focus your attention on your breathing. Some ask you to focus your attention on what you're smelling. There are walking meditations where you sort of take in the visual inputs of the world around you, and you focus on that. There's in the world of mindfulness, there's the body scan, and you focus on what your body feels. So part of it is that it really shouldn't be that unusual of a concept to focus on a physiological process of the body. But in this particular case, the reason I call it a hybrid practice is that it is taking advantage of this sexual element. And when we looked at the other brain scans, especially during the practice itself, we see some areas of the brain that seem to be active, that are part of the areas of the brain that are involved in sexual perception, the sexual sensations. However, what to me was very interesting and distinct about this practice is that if you were to look at studies where they just look at sexual stimulation, and people have done that, then not all, but many of the areas of the brain sort of keep becoming more and more active until you get to the moment of climax or orgasm itself, where everything then drops down. What's different about this practice, and I was very intrigued by it from the outset, is that because you're talking about not actually, or at least that's not the goal, is to have the climax, that these higher areas of the brain, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, seem to be quieting down before you get to that kind of state. So that in and of itself is kind of interesting, because that is more what we see in a more, quote unquote, traditional meditation practice, where you're just concentrating on an object or an image, or you might be focusing on your breath. So there seems to be some elements with which we are seeing evidence of the sexual stimulation be part of the process, but you're also seeing it be more like a traditional kind of meditation practice, which leads me to make that statement that I think it's a bit of a hybrid. I mean, arguably speaking, they're all hybrid practices, because they all, utilize these different rhythms and sensory processes. Nothing is completely devoid of the combination, but it's certainly a hybrid of sexuality and spirituality in that context.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Andy. Kate, you're up next.
Hi. Hello, Dr. Andrew. So
Hey there.
nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Sorry, I've got a little thing. Okay, this was absolutely fascinating. I think I can pre-order the book here in the UK. I'm certainly going to try.
I hope so.
But I loved how you were kind of, in all the material you were talking about and in the study, it was like bridging the place between the brain and the mind, and it kind of felt like going backwards and forwards, and anything that touches that is just fascinating. So to hear OM being talked about in that way is beyond exciting. And there was one bit you talked about, the parietal lobe, is that how you say it?
Yes, parietal. Mm-hmm.
Parietal lobe. And did I understand correctly? I think you said that that's the area of the brain, that's activity in the area of that brain is linked to a sense of like self. And then could I say like separate self? Is that right? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so what it does is when it's turned on, so to speak, it's taking our sensory information, and it helps to differentiate ourselves from the world. So it's the area of our brain that when you get up at the end of this webinar and you leave your room, that it navigates you through the doorway, and it does help you to distinguish between yourself and other. When you reach for an object, the parietal lobe is involved with figuring out, where it is in the environment. And so what we had hypothesized many years ago, this goes back to the work with my mentor, Eugene DeQuilly, that if instead of turning on to give you your sense of self, if that area begins to quiet down, then you begin to lose your sense of self. You no longer have that sensory information upon which to work with. And so you have a blurring of that boundary between yourself and other, whatever the other may be. And that other could be another person, if you're talking about just sexuality and mating. It could be other members of a group, maybe if you're sitting in a house of worship, all of the people together are part of that, that oneness, so to speak. But you could be one person and have a feeling of oneness with everything. And so it really can blur that boundary completely. And one last little, I think, interesting caveat, and this still remains to be fully evaluated, but there may be a little bit of a distinction between left and right, that the left parietal lobe may be a little bit more involved in self-other, and the right may be a little bit more involved in kind of the objects in the world, so to speak. So arguably speaking, you could have kind of a loss of the sense of self, and you feel that connection with something else, but you can also have this sort of, everything kind of goes away, and there's not just a oneness between you and the world, but there's a oneness of everything. And so it depends on the given practice. It depends on the given experience. There's a continuum of this, and that makes it very, very interesting. And it goes also to your other point about the interesting distinctions between the mind and consciousness, however we wind up defining that, with the brain, and how that all is related or interrelated, and where they all come from, and what they all mean. And that to me is a big part of what neurotheology, I think, can help us understand too.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much. Like anywhere where that kind of spirituality and science completely agree, I find like heart racingly exciting. So thank you so much for that.
I do too. I appreciate that. And that I do think, that this is part of the, going back to Bob's early question to me, I mean, part of why I got into all of this was realizing this notion that, to really sort of truly understand who we are and how we perceive reality, while science is wonderful and terrific, and I love it certainly, but it has its limitations, and the religious and spiritual side can be wonderful also, but it has its limitations. And so finding those common pathways and some type of hybrid approach, to use that term again, to me is part of how we might ultimately be able to answer those really big questions philosophically and theologically and scientifically.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for your part in that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for coming today. This has been an amazing conversation. Thanks, Dr. Andrew. So just so everybody knows, we have a very special webinar scheduled for August 6th. That is the day that Sex, God, and the Brain is unleashed onto humanity, and we are going to be that much better for it. And so we would love for you to join us again. The link will be in the chat to attend the webinar on August 6th. So please register for that. And then, of course, there's a link to go out and buy the pre-sale of Sex, God, and the Brain, this wonderful new book by Dr. Andrew Newberg, who has been so gracious to join us today. Andy, it's wonderful to see you. I really enjoyed this, as I always do. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks to everyone. I apologize. I saw some questions there. So if anybody wants to, they can reach out to me through my website as well. So happy, which is just andrewnewberg.com. And there's more information on the book, but people can link to me as well if they have questions.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.